Hello and welcome to the 18th episode of A Woman Robbed, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is, where we talk about actresses who may have come close to earning Oscar nominations but were ultimately overlooked or omitted or for one reason or another just didn't have the votes to make it into the final lineup, and discussing why they may have deserved to get in and why they ultimately didn't. Each episode has its own theme, double feature, and this week we're going to be covering two performances from the 80s that didn't earn Oscar nominations. And my guest today is a frequent guest on this show who's joined me for multiple Best Actress episodes and a Best Picture episode last year where we talked Poor Things, and the very first episode of Woman Robbed. Now he's back from Next Best Picture and the Halloweener horror movie podcast. Welcome back to the show, Cody Dericks.
Hello, Kevin Dearest.
Oh, that's very nice. I was going to do like a fake orgasm to start this, but I think that might not be appropriate. I don't know.
Well, especially because I was thinking about saying Daddy Dearest, and then that may have been really troubling. It's Patreon. It's behind the paywall.
It's after dark content here. I think on that note, we should get right into it. So to introduce the topic here, presented to the patrons, a list of 15 of the most notable performances from the 80s that weren't nominated. And the choices were Isabelle Adjani in Possession, Norma Alejandro in The Official Story, Jamie Lee Curtis in A Fish Called Wanda, Judy Davis in My Brilliant Career, Faye Dunaway in Mommie Dearest, Sally Field in Steel Magnolias, Melanie Griffith in Something Wild, Diane Keaton in Shoot the Moon, Andie MacDowell in Sex, Lies, and Videotape, Carmen Maura in Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, Michelle Pfeiffer in Married to the Mob, Jenna Rollins in Another Woman, Meg Ryan in When Harry Met Sally, Barbra Streisand in Yentl, and Kathleen Turner in Romancing the Stone. A great group of performances there, but the top two vote getters were Faye Dunaway and Meg Ryan. And this was a super close vote where Meg Ryan and Faye Dunaway just edged out Sally Field and Isabelle Adjani, both of whom I'd love to talk about on another episode, hint, hint to the patrons. But yes, we're talking Mommie Dearest and we're talking When Harry Met Sally, two very different films that share very little DNA, unless, Cody, you happen to find some connective tissue that I haven't thought of, which I'd love to hear. I don't know, we'll talk about it. But first, would love to just know if you have any overall thoughts on the 80s in film. Like, what is your relationship to this decade in film, especially for actresses? The movie landscape. Obviously, we talked about 1981 on the Best Actress series, and we're kind of revisiting that race today. But what are your overall thoughts on this decade?
So the 80s, I feel like, was a decade for Best Actress of favorites because it's when they really lock into Meryl and Jessica Lange and other people who just kind of show up every year, basically. And that's all well and good, but I think it really limited the Oscars, the Academy in general's perspective as to like the types of films they wanted to recognize. You know, the thing about Best Actress throughout history, as you are well aware, is that the thing that makes it so delightful is that you see a lot of movies, if you're watching through that category, that aren't necessarily part of the Academy's overall purview just because they like their boys. Yeah. So the 80s are kind of like a mix of both, especially with 1981, the Mommie Dearest year. There is some significant crossover with other big movies of that year, but not so much with 1989. It's kind of a lot of one-offs or movies that weren't otherwise in the Academy's favor. So the 80s, I feel like there's a lot of missing pieces here in terms of contenders that could have been. Like Meg Ryan, we're about to talk about her. There's just a lot of loved performances to this day that weren't in the Academy's vision.
Yeah. I think overall, not even just with Oscars, it's a pretty tough decade for women in film or Hollywood film. At least from my viewpoint, a more conservative decade, obviously, compared to the 60s and 70s. It's Reagan era. It just feels a little less risky overall, I would say, and therefore slightly less interesting. But having said that, we do definitely have a lot of great actresses emerging in this era, like Glenn, like Meryl, like Sigourney Weaver, and Michelle Pfeiffer, and Whoopi. You know, a lot of people doing very compelling work and having a real feminist edge to them, too. And maybe the more action macho films and comedies are what people think of more with this decade, but this is a decade with a lot of great female performances too, and we're going to talk about two of them today. I think if I were to connect them, I would look specifically at the actresses themselves, because I think both Faye and Meg had to deal with some Hollywood sexism to a different extent, certainly. But like when you look at what happened to Faye after Mommie Dearest, I think it's pretty bleak. And with Meg, I think she was sometimes a little dismissed in terms of her abilities, her acting skills, compared to her being like a movie star presence. And she also had to deal with some backlash further in her career when she was doing things like In the Cut. So that definitely affected her career moving forward. So there's a little bit there that's connecting this,
Yeah.
but
It's also
yeah.
interesting because I feel like this represents two very important points in these two women's careers, for better or for
Mm-hmm.
worse. This is kind of the end of the line for Faye Dunaway.
Yeah,
It's a hard stop to the insane trajectory that began about 15 years earlier with Bonnie and Clyde. And for Meg Ryan, this is just the beginning. It's not her film debut. It's definitely her, I think, lead debut, or at least in a
yeah.
mainstream big movie like this. She
Mm-hmm.
was noticed in Top Gun like 3 years earlier, but this is definitely her showcase and her showing what she can do and, collaborating with Nora Ephron, obviously, which would be very fruitful for the both of them in the next decade.
Exactly. Yeah, so big turning points for both of them. Excited to explore them both. So we're starting off with the heavier one, ultimately, because we're going in chronological order. Let's get right into it. Faye Dunaway in Mommie Dearest.
You drove Al Steele to his grave, and now you're trying to stab me in the back? Forget it! I fought worse monsters than you for years in Hollywood. I know how to win the hard way.
Miss Crawford, we don't want any hard feelings.
You don't know what hard feelings are until I come out publicly against your product, and you'll see how much you sell.
Please, Miss Crawford. It's hardly necessary to make threats you surely don't mean.
Don't fuck with me, fellas! This ain't my first time at the rodeo.
So by this point in her career, Faye had gotten those 3 Oscar nominations and her win for Network. This is 5 years after that. And this is, as we said, a very big point in her career. This was the film that she has publicly stated compromised her career. So Mommie Dearest is based on the book by Christina Crawford, which she published the year after her mother, Joan Crawford's death. And it details the abuse she faced from Joan, who adopted her at an early age. This was a very controversial book that was denounced by a lot of Joan's friends, but it became a huge bestseller and was quickly optioned to be adapted to film, with Anne Bancroft originally attached to play Joan, but she dropped out because she was unsatisfied with the script, and it landed on Faye's desk, and she signed on, and she claims to not have known too much about, some of the behind-the-scenes drama happening with this, including some word spreading around Hollywood that anyone who took on this role would have their reputation ruined, essentially. Plus, there were many rewrites and a desire to expand upon Christina's book, which further complicated the veracity of some of the things claimed in the film. So, to get into it here, Mommie Dearest gives us a very heightened, dramatized version of the complicated relationship between Joan and Christina, and we're also tracking Joan, who's trying to salvage her career after being labeled box office poison, and winning her Oscar for Mildred Pierce, and having some career fluctuations from there, finding multiple male suitors and becoming alcoholic and lashing out at Christina for not being the perfect doting child that she wanted her to be, and not having an interest in Joan's desire to mold her into a disciplined person like she was. So, yes, let's talk Miss Faye Dunaway. Cody, so curious about your relationship with Faye and her very divisive performance here in Mommie Dearest.
Faye is an actress who I will admit I have more of a limited scope than I think most people in our world. I've
Mm-hmm.
seen her big ones. I've seen all her nominees. Obviously, I've seen this
Yeah.
film. She's an actress of immense power, obviously. She is somebody who is clearly unafraid on screen to just kind of go for it. And it's one of those situations where it's hard to separate what we know about her behind the scenes versus on camera, which I feel like this performance doesn't help in that regard because I feel like she's playing somebody who had a similar experience with the behind the scenes on the camera discrepancy as she did, which maybe makes her perfect for the role, but I think the way that the film ends up playing out maybe hurt her not just her career, but also her perspective amongst people like us. The movie itself, I saw it when I was younger and didn't really think much of it, and then I watched it again a few years ago with a group of homosexuals, as you do,
Sure.
expecting it to be the kind of campy drag race acting challenge vibe you think it's going to
Hmm.
be. I've seen it clips of it played at gay bars. It definitely has its place in culture, and I would say 85% of its legacy now is as camp comedy.
Hmm.
And watching it with a group who either we hadn't seen the whole thing or not all of us had seen it in a long time, the energy very much deflates as you're forced to
Yeah.
actually watch the film because man, it's upsetting.
Hmm.
Man, it's not fun. It is really not the film that its reputation would have you believe it is. It is harrowing. It is slow paced. Also, it's not like it's ridiculous and zany and over the top. It's over the top in many ways, but the actual scenes that get quoted the most, like the wire hanger scene, are no fun, which
Hmm.
maybe is not surprising because when you learn the context of them, or even if you haven't seen the film, if you just know what it's about, maybe that doesn't scream fun, ridiculous, can't be time, but it's somehow morphed into that, whether that's because of studio marketing or what have you, or gay men with poor taste, I'll just say it. But the movie itself, I think, is actually pretty fascinating. I
Hmm.
think what's happening here is an interesting dissection of like Hollywood myth, which is so appropriate for this time where it's just after New Hollywood, so it's like postmodern of populist American cinema. And it is so soon after Joan Crawford's death. It's less than 5 years since she
Yep.
died that they're making this movie,
The
which
body
makes
isn't
me
cold
think,
yet.
literally, which makes me
Yeah.
think part of this movie's failure and subsequent reputation as like, oh, that's not even like a real movie. It's just camp. It's ridiculous. Might be a bit of subterfuge on behalf of like people that Joan worked with. I'm being conspiratorial and speculative here, but I just have to think that there were people who watched this movie and went, well, that's not the Joan I knew. And
Hmm.
we've since learned that there's dispute as to the truthfulness and honesty of the memoir, and of course that feeds into the movie. So yeah, there's a lot going on with this film that I think is not entirely the film's fault. And I think honestly, very little of the film's failure, which I still think is a good film, you can lay at the feet of Faye Dunaway, who I think is doing exactly what she's supposed to be doing. I don't think there's any better or worse way to do this performance that doesn't feed into exactly what the movie wants her to do. So in that way, I can't call it a bad performance because I think she's tapped into exactly the energy of the film and the character and the specifics of the scene she's given.
Totally. Yes. I think for me, this is one of the better examples of someone who I think it's where it's truly a great performance in a pretty average to sometimes bad movie, and how we should still celebrate that as worthy of recognition. Because I think she absolutely tears into this role with so much ferocity. I feel like that's the right word for it, that it's like frightening at times. It's frightening to me how much she is channeling Joan. I mentioned this in my letterbox review this week that like a few times that I've actually written out like talking about this movie, I've actually written it as Joan Crawford in Mommie Dearest rather than Faye Dunaway in Mommie Dearest, because it's just like such a full-fledged performance that it's like that illusion somehow is there for me. And Faye has said that she exercised her mouth and her jaw to more accurately look like Joan and express herself like Joan. And there are shots in the film where it's almost uncanny, I find. And it does remind me so much of her, plus the voice too. So yeah, I think she is probably, for me, the only person probably in the entire cast and crew who gave this the seriousness and the complexity that this story deserves, quite frankly, because for me, the direction is kind of adrift at times. I think the writing is very on the nose, right down to the last line about Christina getting the last word and all that. And the tone is kind of all over the place. So for me, it is really just Faye who is the only one who makes this worth watching and worth studying, because she fully understands, I think, I would imagine, who Joan is and her background and how she built herself up in this industry from nothing, and, fought against the studios, and they always or frequently wanted to discard her, and how she felt that lack of love, I think, from the industry and wanted that satisfied in her personal life and probably put her daughter in a very impossible situation ultimately, but she just wanted that kind of unconditional love from anyone, and Christina didn't give her that. And so she lashed out and she channeled all of that rage about her career and her life into her because she couldn't risk her reputation, at work or in public or anything. And so it just fully turned inward ultimately. And I think she just completely gets that context and fully commits to playing an extremely flawed person who was definitely prone to outbursts, but it was all because of those inner demons.
Right, it's like performance via seance. I really agree with what you're saying about it's hard to see Faye Dunaway here because, first of all, she looks like Joan enough that the illusion is real, and you and I are people who've seen enough Joan Crawford, and she's so invested. She's so deep in this character. Whether or not that's even an accurate Joan Crawford, she's deep in whatever this character on the page is. The funny thing is, I feel like until the wire hanger scene, it's almost a Joan Crawford movie, or maybe a little bit earlier, before the abuse really kicks into high gear. It feels like a movie that Joan Crawford would have been in. It's about a woman who is sad in her life despite the wonders she has around her, and she just really wants to be a mother. It feels like something that Joan Crawford would have signed on to or had affection for. Which then there's an interesting thing there that the movie never delves into of like, how did she separate on camera from off camera? The movie is not really interested in that. The movie is most interested in being kind of salacious, in painting her as this portrait of motherhood as monster. And there's little clues throughout the film as to Joan Crawford as a human that I think the film willfully ignores. There's mentions of she had 7 miscarriages with her previous husband, and clearly she has unchecked, before they even had a term for this, I'm sure, obsessive compulsive disorder and all sorts of other things going on. She's an alcoholic, at least as portrayed in the film. She definitely is, and the movie is not interested in that. The movie is interested in her as this object of outward mania, and everything else is kind of symptomatic of that rather than being vice versa, which is more likely the truth.
Yeah, for me it's just the perspective feels a little strange to me when you're watching the film, because it feels like this is Christina's story, but then it feels like it's mostly just Joan. So it's very odd to me in terms of the approach here, which is why I think, like I said, the direction and the writing just feel not up to Faye's standard in what she's doing. I do want to mention a little bit about the opening, even though we don't actually see her face till the next scene, I think, where it's like this multi-step routine where she's getting ready in the morning and she has the ice chips on her face. And then there's just like this vigorously scrubbing her arms and her hands. And even though we don't actually get a shot of her face in that sequence, I do think she communicates a lot there about just how disciplined she is to an obsessive compulsive level. Just having to keep up this impossible youth and beauty to it feeling truly pathological. And I feel like even with like the visual language of it and the score, I can sort of sense this level of her being so hypercritical of any flaws. And it's reflective in the scene too, of them like moving the plant in the beginning and seeing the dirt underneath and telling the maid, "I'm not mad at you, I'm mad at the dirt." Like that kind of sums up her personal philosophy in a way, how she's just like such an impossible perfectionist and creates such impossible goals and demands for herself and also for others that it does alienate people. And again, that is, to your point a little bit, what makes Faye's casting so brilliant, I would say, because she is, from everything that we've read at least, quite a bit like Joan in that regard, and it takes her work very, very seriously to the point of alienating people, including people on this very set. So yeah, I think just like I said right away, it just sets you up, just the intensity with which she does everything, her speaking and her gestures, really.
Right. I feel like the Joan Crawford in this film, if she at one point had called somebody a little homosexual boy, it would not be out of character. Yeah. So maybe your point there about a merging of souls there is true. And all those details, I'm just not quite sure what the film wants us to do with that. Again, like you said, it starts with her with this almost like it's like a scene out of The Aviator where she's like bathing herself and putting ice in her face. It's very intense. Or Sunset Boulevard. It's very grand
Hmm.
and meticulous. And then there's the scene with the dirt, and I don't know what the movie wants us to do with that. Do they want us to feel bad for her? Or I think what actually probably is happening is, and this wouldn't happen anymore, is it's meant to make her look, for lack of a better word, crazy. She has
Yeah.
these compulsions, and there's no sympathy afforded to it. It's just kind of one more element of what made her crazy, as the film wants us to think she is, which, makes the abuse more inevitable and more believable.
Yeah. If I were to give it a generous read, I would say that it is just setting up how obsessive she is about herself and how she turns that stuff onto Christina ultimately, now that she has an outlet for it in a way. But I do agree that ultimately I would imagine it is probably just to set up her as like this monstrous figure more than anything else. And that's just kind of the end of it. But then, of course, once we have Christina reaching a certain age, we're seeing her kind of wanting to instill some of the same discipline that Joan has into her. Like at one point, she's saying, like, I don't want her growing up a spoiled Hollywood brat. And I think part of that is a little bit of pride, too, of wanting Christina to have her discipline. And so she earns any achievements that she gets rather than have it be just because she's the daughter of Joan Crawford. But there's like this kind of ruthless, competitive look in her eyes that I really love to see, which Faye did have in Network as well. Similar type of energy there. That is kind of terrifying, but also very evocative, just like this hyper focus and drive that you can't look away from it because of how rare I think it is to see a woman in general on screen in a leading role in that light.
Right. I mean, it's not like Sally Field is playing this part. It's being played by an actress who I don't think anybody walking in who knew Faye Dunaway was surprised to see her do this performance in this way. It's just that the film
Yeah,
became so ill-regarded because I think she's doing exactly what she's supposed to do. I don't think there's
absolutely.
anything else you could have done here. At least what she's able to do that would make the film better or worse. She's totally locked in.
Yeah, definitely. And we're also seeing her having a lot of trouble with men, like this lawyer she has who she was in a relationship with, but she insults him, or he insults her for getting older, basically, and she calls him a cheap lawyer, but then she kind of senses where this is going and starts to little acquiesce a little bit to him, and just that sort of mercurial energy I think is very unsettling from Faye, but it's that undercurrent of not wanting to be alone that really comes through. And even when he like accuses her of acting through this argument and she says, I'm not acting, it is probably true, but there's also such a melodrama to it and a theatricality to how Joan conducts herself that it can sort of feel like the whole Norma Desmond and Sunset Boulevard thing of like the movies kind of just blending with reality for her. And to the point that maybe being in this position of becoming Joan Crawford, the Hollywood star, that only kind of exacerbated those flaws that she has.
Right. I mean, we're not really ever afforded a scene where we see Joan Crawford at anything but a 10. She's
Yeah.
always shown as being this like Medusa figure. We never get to
Yeah.
see her at a standard.
Hmm.
So again, I'm not quite sure what else Faye was supposed to do with this character besides be at that level the whole time.
Yeah. She's doing what is asked of her. And even going beyond that, going beyond the 10 into 11, 12
Absolutely. Yeah.
frequently. But I do think certain script and direction choices do maybe hurt her performance in a way. Like she does have this very vulnerable scene at one point with LB Mayer, for example, where she's come to him to kind of make good on how much of a star player she's been at MGM and is hoping for better scripts. And he calls her box office poison. And you can tell that those words really do hurt her. But then that is just immediately followed by her cutting up flowers in the garden and demanding, Tina, bring me the axe. And she's just bringing this unhinged energy there. But it is so cartoonish, as sort of darkly funny as scenes like that can be, that for me, it does kind of just undercut it in a way.
Yeah, I mean, when she really kicks into high gear, it is something to see. Derogatory and
Yeah.
complimentary.
Yeah.
It's almost superhuman to see somebody exerting this much for a movie that is not interested in meeting her on the level at all. The movie is very
Yeah.
bland in everything except for her performance. So that probably is what lent it the energy of like, oh, this is campy. It's like ridiculous because her and the film are not shaking hands really.
Yeah.
Um, and that discrepancy does kind of destabilize everything. But again, Faye's doing what she's supposed to do. I really can't reiterate that enough that she understood the assignment.
Thank you for listening to this preview of A Woman Robbed, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup.is and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.